The rain lashed against the glass-panelled doors of Greystone Manor, as if trying to awaken an old forgotten tale. Somewhere in the shrouded darkness of the night, a scream rose, sharp, fleeting, swallowed by the howling wind. A body lay motionless on the study floor, a shattered whiskey glass nearby, and a single drop of blood slowly sinking into the rich Persian rug. But the real secret was this. This was not just a murder, it was only the beginning, and what would unfold in the next few hours would strip away every lie, every mask, and expose the buried truths that Greystone Manor had guarded for far too long. Greystone Manor was a place that had once been the heart of grandeur, but time had carved its relentless signature into every corner. The chandeliers still hung, their crystal ornaments dulled with dust, like lifeless eyes witnessing the echoes of a bygone era. The Persian rugs remained thick beneath one's feet, but the imprint of countless steps had woven ghostly patterns into them, as if shadows had been pacing these halls for generations. The air carried the scent of aged books, forgotten conversations, and a lingering dampness, as though the walls themselves were exhaling secrets. Outside, the rain fell in a steady whisper, misting the leaded windows and dimming the flickering candlelight within. The anniversary gathering was no grand affair, no speeches, no lavish toasts, just a select few guests and a quiet tension that thickened the air like an unseen fog. Richard Carstairs stood by the fire, turning his brandy glass between his fingers, his gaze fixed on the flames, though his mind lingered on a different fire, one that burned with old questions and buried truths. He was a man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, with a presence that demanded control. His rare smiles never reassured, they unsettled. "And so," he said, his voice stretching into the silence, "here we all are again." Lady Elena Carstairs, once the true matriarch of the house, sat stiffly in her high-backed chair by the fireplace. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her once commanding presence now reduced to a frail frame, though her eyes still held remnants of an old dignity. "This house has been in our family for generations," she said, her voice weak but edged with steel. "To part with it so thoughtlessly, sentimentality doesn't pay for a crumbling estate." Richard cut in coldly. "The world moves forward, and so must I." For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the measured ticking of the grandfather clock. Across the room, Dr. Harold Montrose swirled his whiskey with the slow ease of a man who had long learned to drown his nerves. A thin, sharp-witted physician, he had seen too much in his lifetime to be easily rattled. "The world moves forward," he echoed softly. "Funny thing about that, some move with it, others don't." Near the window Sarah Barnes traced absent patterns in the condensation. She was a woman of quiet reserve, her auburn hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her expression serene, too serene. But her eyes betrayed something deeper, something simmering beneath the surface. "Some things aren't so easily buried," she said, her voice calm yet heavy with meaning. The wind outside howled, rattling the old panes, as if the house itself was restless. James Holloway, the butler who had served this family for decades, silently refilled Lady Elena's teacup, his hands as steady as ever, unaffected by the storm, whether outside or within. Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. "Ah, here we go again, the grand moralizing," he said, the faintest trace of amusement in his voice. "Is that why you came, Sarah? To remind me of the sins of the past?" Sarah turned from the window, her movements slow and deliberate. "The past has a way of catching up," she said, "especially in houses like this, where the walls remember." Richard studied her for a long moment, then shook his head with a smirk. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Sarah." She didn't respond. The fire crackled, its glow stretching the shadows across the room. The conversation drifted towards safer topics, London politics, the grim state of the stock market, but the unease remained, a silent undercurrent running beneath every word. It was as if the manor itself was watching, waiting. Then abruptly, Richard straightened, setting his empty glass down with a deliberate thud. "I've been looking into some old family matters," he said, his voice casual, but there was a glint in his eyes, one that had nothing to do with mere curiosity. "You all remember my great-uncle Edmund, don't you?" Silence, a deep, weighted silence. Of course they remembered Edmund Carstairs, a man found dead in this very house, in this very room, exactly 20 years ago to the day. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've been reading the reports, asking a few questions," he continued, "and it seems to me something never quite added up about his death." Outside the storm howled louder, as if the manor itself was listening. The walls stood still, their secrets pressed deep within their bones, but perhaps, just perhaps, they were ready to speak. Greystone Manor loomed like a beast in the dark, its ancient bones creaking with the weight of unsaid words. The storm outside lashed against the towering windows, lightning carving jagged scars of light across the opulent yet decaying walls. The chandeliers still hung, their crystals dulled with dust, but their once grand brilliance had long since faded, much like the lineage that had once called this place home. Shadows danced over the Persian rugs, stretching and recoiling as if whispering secrets to the very floorboards that had borne witness to decades of treachery. At the heart of the room, Richard Carstairs stood, his fingers curling idly around his brandy glass, the golden liquid swirling like a slow-moving storm of its own. He was a man of precision, control, and buried truths. But tonight, something in his eyes shimmered with a restless intent. "Here we are again," he said, his voice smooth yet carrying the faintest trace of mockery, slicing through the uneasy quiet that had settled over the gathering like a shroud. Lady Elena Carstairs, once the sovereign of this house, sat rigid in her chair by the fire, her spine as straight as the bloodline she clung to, her knuckles ghost white against the stem of her untouched wine-glass. "This house is not just stone and wood, Richard," she murmured, her voice thin but unyielding. "It is memory, it is legacy." Richard let out a breath of amusement, tilting his head as he studied her, then the others. "Legacy doesn't pay the debts, Aunt Elena. This place is a relic, a mausoleum to ghosts no one cares to remember." A silence heavier than the storm settled. Across the room, Dr. Harold Montrose stirred his whiskey with deliberate slowness, his keen eyes unreadable behind the glint of the firelight. Sarah Barnes, seated near the window, her fingers idly tracing the condensation on the glass, didn't look up, but the tension in her shoulders spoke louder than words. "Some ghosts refuse to be forgotten," she said, her voice low, almost lost beneath the thunder that cracked through the night. Richard's smile deepened. "Ah, the dramatics again, Sarah. You always did enjoy a bit of theatrics." A gust of wind howled through the old corridors beyond, rattling a distant door, just a trick of the wind, or something older and unseen shifting in the house's depths. James Holloway, the butler who had served this family long enough to understand its unspoken rules, moved soundlessly as he refilled Lady Elena's glass. His hands were steady, practiced, yet in the dim glow of the candelabra, a fleeting tightness in his jaw betrayed something more. "Unfinished business rarely stays buried," Sarah continued, meeting Richard's gaze now, her emerald eyes sharp. "Especially not here." The grandfather clock let out a deep resounding chime, marking the hour with an almost ominous finality. Richard set his glass down, the sound a sharp punctuation to the tension in the room. "Well then," he said, voice laced with something both amused and deadly serious, "it seems I'm not the only one who's been thinking about Edmund's death." A hush fell, thick and suffocating. The air in the room seemed to tighten, the very walls listening. Edmund Carstairs, his name a curse, a shadow that had lingered for 20 years, staining the very foundation of this house. "I've been doing a bit of digging," Richard continued, his voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. "And it seems to me that the truth of that night was never quite complete." The storm outside roared, the rain a drumbeat against the glass, and somewhere within the bowels of the manor, something groaned, a door shifting, a floorboard sighing, or perhaps the past itself, stirring at last. The storm had not yet loosened its grip on Blackthorn Hall, the wind still howling through the hollow corridors, rattling the great windows as if the very house protested the weight of its secrets. The scent of damp wood and old paper mingled with the faint, unmistakable iron tang of blood. Inside the grand study, a heavy mahogany desk bore silent witness to the scene unfolding upon it. Jonathan Ashford, heir to the estate, lay slumped forward, his once commanding presence reduced to a grotesque tableau of lifelessness. His hand, fingers still curled as if gripping an unseen thread of control, rested inches from the brandy decanter, its contents untouched, its crystal stopper reflecting the low flicker of the fireplace. The mark at the base of his skull was brutal, a wound too precise to be the work of mere rage. The old grandfather clock against the wall ticked methodically, indifferent to the horror that had played out before it. Midnight, the exact hour his father had died in the same room, under the same circumstances 25 years ago. Inspector Aldous Greaves stood just beyond the threshold, his bulldog-like frame rigid, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his rain-dampened hat. He had seen death before, too much of it, but something about this was different. The air itself felt charged, as though the past had bled through the walls to take its due. Across the room, Lady Eleanor Ashford stood in her silk robe, her once imposing figure diminished only slightly by the weight of the years. Her expression was carved from stone, but her knuckles whitened against the polished wood of the mantel. "It's happening again," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. At the far end of the room, Miss Evelyn Harrow, the ever-perceptive guest of the Ashfords, moved with measured grace, her gloved fingers trailing along the edge of a bookshelf, as she took in the scene with quiet intensity. "Patterns," she said softly, more to the air than to anyone in particular. "Murders like these, they do not happen in isolation, they are echoes of something unfinished." James Holloway, the butler, stood near the door, his gaze carefully averted, but the tremor in his fingers betrayed him as he straightened the silver tray on the sideboard, an unconscious ritual, perhaps to ground himself against the horror of yet another master of the house taken before his time. Somewhere in the hall beyond, a floorboard creaked, a sound too deliberate to be mere settling wood. The storm outside roared, its voice pressing against the very bones of the house, and for the briefest moment, every candle in the chandelier above flickered, as if something unseen had exhaled through the room. Inspector Greaves exhaled sharply, stepping forward at last, his presence like an anchor against the unraveling tension. "Lock every door," he commanded, his voice rough, unyielding. "No one leaves this house, not until I know which one of you has done this, and why." Silence swallowed the room, thick and suffocating, until it was broken by the slow rhythmic tapping of Evelyn Harrow's nails against the armrest of a chair. "The past has sharp teeth, Inspector," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the body, "and tonight it has bitten again." The wind outside howled, and somewhere deep within the manor, a door creaked open, though no one had touched it. The air inside Blackthorn Hall was thick with the scent of wax-damp stone, and something darker, something that made the breath come a little shallower, the skin prickle with unease. The storm outside had not abated, the rain lashing against the high windows like ghostly fingers demanding entry. Inside the grand study, the heavy wooden desk bore silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded upon it. Jonathan Blackwood, his once commanding presence reduced to a slumped figure, his head tilted unnaturally, his lifeless fingers frozen over an unfinished note. The ink from his overturned inkwell bled across the page, mingling with the darker stain seeping through his waistcoat, a single gunshot wound, close range. Inspector Aldous Greaves stood in the doorway, his stocky frame casting a long shadow in the flickering candlelight. His eyes, sharp beneath the brim of his rain-dampened hat, took in the scene with grim efficiency. He was not a man given to fancy theories or undue dramatics, but two bodies, both Blackwoods, both dead under identical circumstances within the same cursed walls, well, even he had to admit, that was damned peculiar. Across the room, Miss Evelyn Harrow sat in an armchair near the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, the very image of calm detachment. Another suicide, Inspector. Her voice held the faintest trace of amusement. Greaves exhaled sharply. He had not invited her here, but she had a habit of appearing precisely where she was least expected and most inconvenient. He turned his attention to Dr. Harold Montrose, the family physician, who was pacing near the bookshelves, his thin frame trembling slightly, his spectacles catching the firelight in uneasy glints. "This is impossible," he murmured. "A cruel copycat, surely." Evelyn's needles paused for the briefest of moments before resuming their steady rhythm. "Or perhaps," she said, her voice quiet but certain, "the past is speaking to us." Greaves ignored them both, his attention shifting to Constable Dunley, who had been sifting through the desk drawers. "What have you got?" Dunley straightened, holding up a small leather notebook. "Found this beneath his hand, sir. Seems Mr. Blackwood was doing some digging of his own." He flipped through the pages, frowning. Notes on his brother's murder. It seems he wasn't convinced by the official ruling. Greaves took the notebook, scanning the carefully penned entries, names, dates, observations. The final line was only half written. "I believe I have found it. The truth. The one thing that ties it all." And then nothing. A silence heavier than the storm settled over the room. Greaves felt Evelyn's watchful gaze on him, and resisted the urge to sigh. "You have a theory, I suppose?" She smiled faintly. "Oh, I wouldn't presume, Inspector. But I do find it rather interesting that both brothers met their end in precisely the same manner. Tragic coincidence, of course." Greaves grunted. Coincidence or not, he needed statements. The household, those still breathing, was summoned one by one. Lady Blackwood, pale as moonlight, clutched a silk handkerchief, dabbing at dry eyes that had long since given up tears. James Blackwood, the younger cousin, lounged in an armchair, his expression unreadable, his fingers drumming idly against his knee. Dr. Montrose remained jittery, while the housekeeper, Mrs. Ellsworth, stood stiff-backed and watchful, a woman accustomed to keeping secrets. And of course there was Evelyn Harrow, knitting away, observing everything with those sharp, knowing eyes. Then came the first oddity of the night. A constable emerged from behind the desk, holding up a small object between two gloved fingers. "Sir," he said carefully, "found this by the body, a single gold cufflink, its surface gleaming in the firelight." Greaves glanced up, his expression unreadable, but the room had gone very, very still. Somewhere deep within the manor, a door creaked open of its own accord. The grand halls of Blackthorn House had seen generations of secrets, but tonight, the air was thick with something heavier, something unspoken, shifting beneath the surface like a predator in the dark. Inspector Aldous Greaves turned the gold cufflink over in his palm, his jaw set in grim contemplation. "It belonged to the deceased?" he asked. Constable Dunley shook his head, glancing at the body in the chair before subtly checking his own sleeves, where both cufflinks remained intact. Greaves turned his sharp gaze on the gathered suspects. "Well, who among you has lost a cufflink?" A weighted silence followed, a shifting of feet, a shared glance between James Blackwood and Dr. Montrose. Miss Evelyn Harrow, still poised in her chair, finally set her knitting aside, folding her hands in her lap with deliberate care. "Curious," she murmured, her voice as soft as the fire's crackle. "One might think a gentleman would notice such a thing." James offered a slow, indolent smile. "Or one might think someone is planting evidence." Greaves was not in the mood for games. "The cufflink stays with me, and no one leaves this estate until I say otherwise." A collective murmur of discontent swept through the room, but no one dared argue. Miss Harrow rose gracefully, smoothing the folds of her dark gown. "Well, Inspector, I shan't overstay my welcome." "You were never invited," Greaves muttered. She smiled, ignoring him, and stepped out into the dimly lit corridor. Her pace was unhurried, but as she passed the study, she hesitated just long enough to glance back. At the ink-stained pages, at the body, cooling in its chair, at the place where a hand had stilled mid-sentence, never to complete its final revelation. A breath, and then she moved on, her steps muffled by the thick carpeting. Behind her, Greaves frowned at the cufflink, turning it between his fingers, an uneasy sensation settling in his gut. He had the distinct feeling that whatever game had begun here tonight, he was already 2 moves behind, and Miss Harrow, damn her, had seen something he had not. The Greystone Manor Library loomed at the far end of the corridor, lined with towering shelves that smelled of aged parchment and the lingering ghost of pipe smoke. A heavy velvet curtain, drawn halfway over the tall windows, dulled the silver glow of the moon, draping the room in a somber half-light. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth did little to banish the ancient chill buried deep in the stone walls. Miss Harrow settled into a high-backed leather chair, her knitting resting in her lap, her fingers resuming their steady, unhurried rhythm. She was ostensibly alone. Inspector Greaves had retreated to his brooding interviews, James Blackwood to his brandy, Dr. Montrose to his restless pacing. That left Miss Harrow precisely where she wished to be, undisturbed, overlooked, free to observe without scrutiny. People often underestimated a woman who appeared preoccupied. The trick, she had learned, was to appear so engrossed in something trivial that no one bothered to watch too closely. It was a deception she had perfected over the years. The library, despite its grandeur, bore the quiet signs of neglect. Dust lingered in the corners. Some books had not been disturbed in decades, while others bore the unmistakable imprint of frequent use. And then she noticed it. A gap, small, nearly imperceptible, but undeniable. A missing book. And where there was an absence, there was often a reason. Setting her knitting aside with quiet precision, she rose, crossing to the shelf with measured steps. Her fingers traced the spines of the surrounding volumes, lingering over the space where something should have been. An ordinary book, misplaced, a borrowed text, forgotten, perhaps. But Miss Harrow was not in the habit of believing in coincidences. She reached into the gap. Her fingertips met resistance. Slowly, she pressed against the hidden obstruction. A faint click, swallowed almost entirely by the stillness of the library. The air around her seemed to shift, as though someone was holding its breath. Miss Harrow stepped back, listening. The house, ancient and knowing, did not answer. But secrets never remained hidden forever. And this one, it seemed, had just begun to stir. The storm clawed at the windows of Blackwood Manor, rain striking the glass in frantic bursts as the wind howled through the ancient corridors. The house had seen tragedy before, but tonight, something darker seeped through its walls. Inspector Greaves stood in the dim glow of the study, his sharp eyes scanning the scene before him. The body of Victor Blackwood lay sprawled over the grand mahogany desk, a dark stain spreading across his silk waistcoat. The overturned inkwell dripped its last onto scattered pages, notes hastily written, their meaning lost in the pooling ink. A single gunshot wound to the heart, close range. A suicide, some might say. Greaves did not believe in coincidences, not when Victor's brother had met the same fate in this very room, precisely 1 year ago. A quiet rustling drew his attention. Miss Evelyn Harrow sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, her gaze unreadable. She had not been invited to this gathering. But then, Miss Harrow had a way of appearing where death lingered. Another tragic end, she murmured, her voice smooth as silk, or a story repeating itself. Across the room Dr. Felix Moreau paced in restless circles, his fingers twitching at the cuffs of his sleeves. "It's madness," he muttered. "A cruel copycat. It must be." Miss Harrow's hands stilled for the briefest of moments before resuming their rhythm. "Or perhaps," she said, almost too softly, "the past refuses to be buried." Greaves ignored them both, and turned his attention to the constable rummaging through the desk drawers. "Sir," Dunley called out, holding up a small leather journal, "looks like the deceased was investigating his brother's death." Greaves took the notebook, flipping through the pages, dates, names, theories scrawled in careful script. The last entry sent a chill through his spine. "I know who did it, I have proof. Tonight, it ends." Graves exhaled slowly. Whatever truth Victor had uncovered had died with him, or had it? "Inspector." The constable's voice was hesitant. He held up a single gold cufflink, its polished surface catching the firelight. "Found this near the body." Graves turned to the gathered guests. "Who among you is missing a cufflink?" Silence. A flicker of hesitation in James Blackwood's expression, a sidelong glance from Dr. Moreau. Miss Harrow, watching them all, her knitting untouched. A game had begun, and Graves had the uneasy feeling that he was already a move behind. The storm battered the ivy-clad walls of Ashbourne Hall, rattling its stained glass windows like a restless spirit. Inside, the grand drawing-room was dimly lit, the heavy drapes drawn tight against the wind's howling fury. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the dark oak paneling, flickering with the occasional snap of the dying fire. A hush had settled over the room, thick and suffocating, as the gathered occupants awaited what they all knew was inevitable. Miss Evelyn Harrow sat at the center of it all, her delicate hands resting lightly on her lap, a small silver thimble glinting on her finger. Her embroidery lay untouched beside her. She had no need for distractions now. The moment for quiet observation had passed. This was the hour of reckoning. Before her the assembled suspects formed an uneasy tableau. Lord Simon Ashbourne leaned against the mantelpiece, his normally pristine cravat askew, a tumbler of untouched brandy trembling in his grasp. Lady Rosalind, his wife, sat stiff-backed on the velvet chaise, her pale fingers intertwined, knuckles bloodless from the force of her grip. Lionel Graves, the esteemed physician, stood near the writing desk, his gaze darting toward the door as if weighing the possibility of an escape. And then there was Andrew Sterling, the late Lord Ashbourne's trusted secretary, his face a careful mask of impassivity, though his right hand twitched at his side, an involuntary tic Miss Harrow had noted before. They were waiting for the woman who had uncovered more secrets in the last decade than the police had in their lifetime. Miss Harrow inhaled slowly, savoring the sharp scent of aged wood and wax-polished leather, the lingering traces of lavender water that clung to Lady Rosalind's sleeve. Then at last she spoke. 2 men dead, a father and his son, 17 years apart, yet taken in the same manner, in the same house. A coincidence? Her voice was a measured thing, soft, deliberate, cutting through the tension like the first crack of thunder before the storm breaks. She let it stretch, let it settle into the corners of the room where lies festered and half-truths lurked like vermin. Then she turned her gaze to Lord Simon. "Your father's death was ruled a tragic accident, a fatal fall down the west staircase. A misstep, they said. But you never believed that, did you, Lord Ashbourne?" His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "Neither did your brother Henry," she continued, "which is why 3 nights ago he came to me." He had begun asking questions, retracing old steps, uncovering pieces of a story someone wished had remained buried. She turned her gaze to Dr. Graves, whose face had gone ashen. "You were the last to see Henry alive, were you not?" The doctor hesitated. "He wasn't well," he said at last. "He'd been drinking." "No," Miss Harrow interrupted, her voice deceptively mild. "He was clear-headed. He had uncovered something, and he was prepared to act. Which is why when he left your office that night, he never made it home." Lady Rosalind let out a strangled breath, one hand flying to her throat. Andrew Sterling shifted, the first true crack in his composure appearing as his fingers clenched into a fist. Miss Harrow caught it, filed it away. "I imagine Henry thought himself clever," she mused. "I imagine he thought, after all these years, that he was the first to put the pieces together. But someone was ahead of him, someone who had spent nearly 2 decades guarding a truth so terrible, so utterly damning, that they would kill to protect it." The wind shrieked against the windows, a sound like a distant wail. The fire crackled, its embers hissing softly. Miss Harrow tilted her head, watching, waiting, and then slowly, deliberately, Andrew Sterling exhaled. "It was never meant to happen that way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, a confession wrapped in regret, a truth pried from the depths of silence. Miss Harrow allowed herself the ghost of a smile. The storm at last had broken. The storm outside had risen to a fever pitch, rattling the grand windows of Ravenshade Hall like a furious spectre demanding entry. Inside, the drawing-room was a world apart, dark, hushed, the only illumination coming from the embers dying in the marble fireplace, casting long flickering shadows across the room. The air was thick, almost tangible, weighted with the echoes of unspoken words, and the finality of what was about to unfold. Miss Evelyn Harrow sat at the center of it all, her hands folded delicately in her lap, a picture of composed resolve. The suspects were arranged before her, in a tableau of barely restrained tension. Lord Percival St. John stood near the fireplace, his silhouette stiff, the flames casting eerie glows across his angular features. His wife, Lady Clarissa, sat rigid-backed in the winged chair, fingers digging into the embroidered armrest. Dr. Ambrose Vane lingered near the drinks cabinet, one hand resting on the crystal decanter, though he had yet to pour himself a drink. And then there was Charles Redgrave, the ever-watchful butler, standing with military precision by the door, his gaze flicking between the occupants with a trained wariness. They were waiting. Miss Harrow took a slow breath, her voice soft but sharp enough to slice through the silence. Two men, two deaths, years apart, but connected by the same cruel hand. That is not fate. That is design. No one spoke, they only watched her, tension crackling like unseen lightning in the charged air. She let the silence settle, then turned her eyes to Lord Percival. "Your father's death was ruled a tragic accident, a midnight fall down the west staircase. A misstep, they said. But you never believed that, did you?" His fingers curled slightly, but he said nothing. Miss Harrow's gaze shifted. "Neither did your brother, Edward." A flicker of unease. "He came to me 3 nights ago, convinced that history was repeating itself. He had begun asking questions, tracing the shadows of an old crime, and for that he was silenced." A gasp, soft but audible. "Doctor." Vane finally poured himself a drink, the clink of crystal unnaturally loud in the stillness. Miss Harrow continued, her voice measured. "I have spent the past few days following Edward's trail, his records, his notes, meticulous, precise, and do you know what I found?" She let her gaze sweep the room. Not a ghost story, not a tragic accident, but a pattern. Lady Clarissa stiffened, her nails pressing into the fabric of her dress. A pattern of missing funds, of discrepancies in estate records, of medicine bottles unaccounted for in the doctor's logs. She turned her gaze to Dr. Vane, whose hand tightened around his glass. "Edward found something that led him here to this room on the night he died." Lord Percival's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "What are you suggesting?" Miss Harrow tilted her head, watching him as one might a chess piece in the final stages of a game. "Edward was poisoned before he ever reached the stairs. The fall was a mere afterthought, a way to make his death seem like history repeating. But there was one mistake." She let the words settle, then turned to Charles Redgrave. "You heard it, didn't you? A sound outside the study." The butler hesitated. "Yes," he admitted at last, voice low, a muffled cough. The room seemed to shrink around them. Miss Harrow's gaze shifted, her voice turning to silk-wrapped steel. "A slip. An error. A moment of carelessness. Just like before, and then like a thread pulled too tight. Something snapped." Dr. Vane exhaled, a sound caught between a sigh and a laugh. "You make it sound so simple." "It often is," Miss Harrow said. The storm finally broke. The fire in the drawing-room had dimmed, its embers pulsing like the last beats of a dying heart. Confession hung in the air, unspoken truths now laid bare like dust stirred from an old forgotten drawer. And Miss Evelyn Harrow sat in the center of it all, her work at last complete. The grandfather clock in the dark-paneled study struck the hour, its deep chime reverberating through the stillness like the toll of a distant funeral bell. The storm outside had dwindled to a whisper, but the tension within Ravenshade Hall remained, thick and oppressive, coiling in the air like smoke. Miss Eleanor Graves sat in the center of it all, hands folded in her lap, her sharp eyes sweeping across the figures arranged before her. Inspector Hale stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, his square face unreadable. Lord Sebastian Ashford lounged in an armchair, his fingers absently drumming against the armrest, his gaze watchful beneath the veneer of nonchalance. Across from him Lady Rosalind sat rigid-backed, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. Dr. Lucian Graves, ever the picture of composed detachment, lingered by the drinks cabinet, the crystal decanter in his grasp betraying the slightest tremor. And then there was Thomas Wren, the butler, standing near the door, silent, motionless, his presence nearly blending into the shadowed corners of the room. The moment stretched, taut and waiting. Then at last, Miss Graves spoke, her voice quiet, but weighted with an authority that commanded attention. 2 deaths, years apart, a father and his son, both ruled as accidents. She let the words settle, but the truth is never so obliging, is it? A hush fell over the room, thick with the unspoken. Dr. Greaves exhaled, shaking his head. Surely you don't mean to suggest, Miss Graves interrupted smoothly, turning her gaze to him. No, doctor, I mean to state. She leaned forward slightly. Lord Edwin Ashford did not fall to his death by misfortune, and neither did his son, Nicholas. Someone ensured that their deaths mirrored each other, and I dare say they thought that made it poetic. A quiet breath from Lady Rosalind, barely audible but charged with something fear perhaps. Lord Sebastian scoffed, but there was no humor in it. And who exactly are you accusing of such a thing, Miss Graves? She tilted her head, watching him. Now that is the question, isn't it? Silence stretched between them, then she continued, her tone deliberate, precise. On the night of Nicholas Ashford's death, someone was outside his study, someone who heard something they shouldn't have. Her gaze shifted. Isn't that right, Mr. Wren? The butler did not move. Did not even blink. The stillness in the room was absolute. A cough, Miss Graves murmured, barely more than a breath. But enough. Lord Sebastian let out a short, incredulous laugh. This is absurd. A cough, a mistake, she corrected, her voice sharper now, a small one, but mistakes are all it takes, aren't they? You see, Nicholas had been investigating his father's death. He'd found something damning, and someone couldn't afford for him to find more. Her eyes gleamed with knowing as they settled once again on the butler. You saw who entered his study that night, Mr. Wren. You saw who walked out alone. The butler's fingers twitched. The first betrayal, the only one she needed. The room seemed to shrink around them, the fire casting restless, flickering shadows against the walls. Dr. Greaves set his glass down with a decisive clink. Enough of this nonsense, he muttered. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, Miss Graves said. When stripped of pretense. And then finally Thomas Wren exhaled. It was a weary sound, a sound that carried 20 years of silence, of secrets buried beneath the weight of duty and fear. I should have spoken then, he said softly. But I did not. Miss Graves studied him, her expression unreadable. And now a long pause, then at last, a nod. Just once. Enough. Inspector Hale stepped forward, the moment shifting, inevitability settling like dust in the wake of truth. The storm outside had passed, but within these walls something far greater had broken. The storm clawed at the manor's towering frame, rain lashing against its ancient stone walls like restless fingers scraping for secrets. The corridors of Blackthorn Hall, long accustomed to silence, now buzzed with the weight of something irreversible. In the grand study, the air was thick with cigar smoke, and the unspoken, a tension that coiled tighter with each breath. Miss Eleanor Graves, her hands folded neatly in her lap, regarded the man before her with the patience of a hunter waiting for a trap to spring. Across the room, Inspector Hale stood rigid, his expression carved from stone, while Sebastian Wells, ever the picture of aristocratic ease, lounged in his chair, fingers drumming idly against his whiskey glass. Lady Celeste Ashford sat near the window, her pale hands clutching the armrest, her gaze distant, as though already mourning something that had yet to be named. And then there was Dr. Victor Langley, standing by the hearth, the firelight flickering against his face, sharpening the angles of his composed mask. If the walls were closing in, he did not let them see it. It was all necessary, Langley murmured at last, his voice smooth, deliberate. You speak of morality, Miss Graves, but you fail to see the design. Edmund Ashford was reckless, he would have destroyed everything. And Richard, a slight smirk ghosted his lips. He should have known better than to meddle in things beyond his understanding. Miss Graves tilted her head, studying him with quiet intensity. And yet here you are, Doctor, caught in the very web you wove. Langley's fingers curled, then relaxed, a calculated breath, a flicker of thought, always one step ahead. But not tonight, not anymore. You make it sound so simple, he said softly. But the truth, Miss Graves, is never simple. No, she agreed, her voice like the whisper of a blade unsheathing, but it is inescapable. The silence that followed was absolute, and then a movement, subtle, intentional. Langley shifted his weight, eyes darting to the corridor, calculating his odds. A mistake, a sharp intake of breath from Lady Celeste was his only warning. Inspector Hale was faster. In one swift motion, he seized Langley's arm, twisting it behind his back. The doctor tensed, a sharp hiss escaping between clenched teeth, but resistance was futile. The iron-cold bite of handcuffs snapped against his wrists. A finality settled over the room, heavier than the storm beyond. It's over, Hale said, his voice low, decisive. Langley exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. Is it? A flicker of something passed through his gaze, not fear but something far more dangerous. A secret yet to be spoken, a truth still buried. Miss Graves saw it, and she knew. This was not the end. As Langley was led from the room, the great clock in the hall struck midnight, and somewhere in the shadows of Blackthorn Hall, the past waited, patient as ever. The door groaned shut behind him, but the echo of Montrose's final words lingered like the last tremors of an earthquake. Miss Eleanor Graves sat motionless, the barest hint of amusement in her gaze, as if the doctor's parting threat had been little more than the tantrum of a petulant child. Across the room, the storm outside cast restless shadows over the faces of those left behind, each one marked by the weight of revelation. The fire crackled in the hearth, yet the room remained cold. Sarah Barnes sat hunched, her hands trembling as she wiped away the remnants of long-held grief. She didn't do it, she whispered, voice fragile as glass. My mother, she didn't. Miss Graves inclined her head slightly. No, my dear, she didn't. The words settled over Sarah like an exorcism, releasing the ghosts that had clung to her for years. Lady Celeste Ashford stood, her movements precise, almost detached. I will be leaving Blackthorn Hall, she announced, her voice measured but distant, as if she had already begun to untether herself from the place. This house, it no longer belongs to me. No one argued. Some wounds could not be mended. Some ghosts could not be banished. Hours later the storm had passed, leaving behind a mist that curled through the village streets like something alive. The small tea shop on Hawthorne Lane was warm, the air thick with the scent of scones and bergamot. Miss Graves sat by the window, her tea steaming beside her, her hands methodically working her knitting needles, click, 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 a rhythm as steady as the turning of the world. Across from her, Sebastian Wells slouched into a chair, his smirk laced with something unreadable. "Well, Miss Graves," he drawled, "another case solved. If you keep this up, Scotland Yard may find itself out of work." A slow, knowing smile flickered at the corners of Miss Graves' lips. "I highly doubt that, Mr. Wells." He studied her, his fingers tapping absently against his glass. "Tell me, did you know all along?" A pause. The faintest quirk of an eyebrow. "Some things," she murmured, taking a measured sip of tea, "are simply a matter of waiting." The clock in the village square chimed, and beyond the window the world moved on, but in the quiet depths of her mind, Miss Graves knew, secrets do not die so easily. The village lay wrapped in twilight, its rooftops dusted with the last embers of sunset, the cobblestone streets hushed in the embrace of an approaching night. Miss Eleanor Graves sat by the window of her sitting room, a delicate porcelain cup cradled between her fingers, the scent of bergamot curling into the air. Outside, laughter echoed, the carefree sound of children darting past, their innocence untouched by the weight of the past. A past that never truly faded, and now, Sebastian Wells leaned back in his chair, one brow arched in lazy curiosity. "No more murderers to catch, Miss Graves?" She did not answer immediately, her gaze following the drifting fog that crept in from the fields, turning the village into a ghost of itself. Then, in a voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the air, she murmured, "Justice is patient, Mr. Wells. It waits, even when we think the past is finished with us." Her fingers moved to the envelope lying on her desk, its ivory paper catching the dim glow of the firelight. No return address, no name. Just a few lines, written in a precise measured hand. "You found the truth. But some secrets should have remained buried." The words were careful, cold, not an overt threat, no crude intimidation, but something subtler, a warning delivered with the precision of a scalpel. Miss Graves turned the envelope over, her fingertips tracing its smooth edges. The paper was ordinary, the sort sold in any respectable stationer's shop, but the weight of it was undeniable, pressing against the quiet of the room like an unseen presence. The fire crackled, sending restless shadows flickering against the lace-curtained windows. Beyond, the village of Blackwood Hollow was settling into its nightly rhythm, lamps dimmed, doors bolted, voices slipping into murmured good nights. A place where things rarely changed, but Miss Graves knew better. Her hands, steady as ever, reached for her knitting. One stitch, then another. The rhythmic click of the needles filled the silence. She had unraveled many threads before, and if tonight had confirmed anything, it was that this one was far from finished. The ink was dark, the handwriting precise, measured, deliberate, absent of emotion, and yet, in its caution, it revealed everything. Fear, a quiet, controlled fear that bled through the spaces between the words. Miss Eleanor Graves ran a fingertip along the edge of the letter, her expression unreadable, her mind already cataloguing possibilities. It was not a threat, not exactly, the lack of exclamation, the restraint in tone, it was something colder, a warning. She exhaled softly, setting the letter beside the single gold cufflink resting on her desk. The fire in the hearth had burned low, embers pulsing with the last remnants of heat, casting restless shadows against the lace-curtained window. The village of Blackwood Hollow was sinking into its nighttime hush, the distant chime of the church bell marking the hour, lamps dimmed behind shuttered windows, voices softened into murmured good nights. It was the illusion of peace. She leaned back in her chair, gaze drifting toward the study beyond the sitting room. The door stood ajar, just enough for the dim glow of the lamp inside to reach across the carpet. That small sliver of light stretched toward the cufflink, a silent accusation. It had been found in the drawing room at Ashworth House, a misplaced detail in a crime carefully constructed. No one had claimed it, not Lord Sinclair, who had left in quiet urgency, not Miss Alden, whose silence was too composed, not even Sebastian Wells, whose easy charm never quite masked the sharp edges beneath. She had watched them all, a hesitation, a flicker of unease, the way a name spoken aloud could tighten a throat, still a breath. The tea in her cup had long since gone cold, but she lifted it to her lips anyway, savoring the weight of the porcelain, the bitter trace of bergamot. It was a familiar ritual, one that kept her hands steady, her thoughts measured. The case had been solved, the past laid bare, and yet, the past had a way of lingering. Secrets did not die, they waited. In forgotten letters, in a single missing cufflink, in the hesitation of a liar who had not yet been caught. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, the glass shivering under its touch. Somewhere deep in Ashworth House, a clock struck midnight. The weight of the night pressed in, heavy with something unfinished. Miss Graves set down her cup, fingers ghosting over the letter one last time before folding it away. The fire flickered, the final embers of its glow casting the room into deepening shadow. Some believed the past could be buried, that what was uncovered could be left behind. But she knew better, she always had, and as she sat in the stillness of her study, staring at the single golden cufflink, glinting in the lamplight, she knew with quiet certainty, this mystery was not over.